Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, I welcome you to a course on Indian cognitive science. It's a very short, in fact a 5-hour introductory course, and it's meant for the DTH Swayamprabha channel. I'm Nirmalya Guha. Little bit about cognitive science first before we go to Indian cognitive science. What we mean by the phrase cognitive science. I read a few quotes from an entry, a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry by Paul Thagard. I will actually use his work very often. I will talk about those later. I read the quotes. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of mind and intelligence, embracing philosophy, psychology, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, linguistics, and anthropology. Among these, we concentrate mostly on philosophy and linguistics because classical Indians did not have access to other things, maybe a bit of psychology we will consider, but they did not have artificial intelligence and neuroscience. This is just to tell you what we are going to do. Then I continued reading. Its intellectual origins are in the mid-1950s, when researchers in several fields began to develop theories of mind based on complex representations and computational procedures. We shall see the implications of all these points later when we actually start talking about Indian cognitive science. The best way to grasp the complexity of human thinking is to use multiple methods, especially psychological and neurological experiments and computational models. Theoretically, the most fertile approach has been to understand the mind in terms of representation and computation. This is very important. This is almost the central point of our whole project. The central hypothesis of cognitive science is that thinking can best be understood in terms of representational structures in the mind and computational procedures that operate on those structures. This is then a little bit about the methodology of it. Most work in cognitive science assumes that the mind has mental representations analogous to computer data structures and computational procedures similar to computational algorithms. Cognitive theorists have proposed that the mind contains such mental representations as logical propositions, rules, concepts, images, and analogies, and that it uses mental procedures such as deduction, search, matching, rotating, and retrieval. Basically, this is an assumption which basically says that the mental elements can be represented or understood as logical propositions, rules like if X then Y, concepts. It can be anything, manness, womanness, bookness, anything, images, basically mental images and analogies. And the procedures, how all these things, the rules, sort of interact with each other and how something comes out of a rule-governed activity. And then how concepts are combined, how a new concept is derived out of old concepts or existing concepts and stuff like that. So, and deduction is the logical procedure from one or more logical propositions. We extract, we derive others. So these are the basic elements of the mind according to cognitive science. So what are the theoretical tools the cognitive scientists use? Mostly they use formal logic. So all kinds of things, prepositional calculus, predicate calculus, lambda calculus, property logic, whatever. You have all the resources in logic. Rules, very important. Rules are there everywhere. Rules are there in grammar. Rules are there in logic. So all these rules become very, very important. Concepts, theoretical neuroscience, psychology. Now, what are the things we can cover in our course? This is now a very, very, very important question. Indian cognitive science. The question is it possible to have kind of an Indian cognitive science? We shall now read some of the quotes of Paul Taggart from this perspective as to we should look for whether it is possible for us to have anything like Indian cognitive science. First of all, I want to read things that can be done as far as this Indian cognitive science is concerned. So it's a quote from Taggart. Theoretically, the most fertile approach has been to understand the mind in terms of representation and computation. This we can see in the classical Indian thought. The Indian thinkers, especially philosophers, knew how to represent almost anything, almost any mental object like cognition or knowledge. And then the computation is basically the process, the procedure of the procedure of deriving new things out of the existing ones. We can also see that the procedures are very, very well described in the Indian philosophical writings. The next point, the central hypothesis of cognitive science. That is, thinking can be best understood in terms of representational structures. As I said, classical Indians were really very great at doing this. They knew how to represent a mental element and then the procedure. So this is one thing perhaps we can do. And the next point is cognitive theorists have proposed that the mind contains such mental representations as logical propositions, rules, concepts, images, whatever. And all these things are somehow covered by the Indian philosophers. Now, what is it we cannot do? Kind of the limitations of Indian cognitive science, if it is possible at all to have something called Indian cognitive science. Once again, I read a quote. The best way to grasp the complexity of human thinking is to use multiple methods, especially psychological and neurological experiments and computational models. Now, this is something we don't have access to. The classical Indian philosophers did not have neurological experiments and psychological experiments. And computational models, of course, they didn't have, but they are very great at model formation. We'll see that, especially perhaps in the fourth lecture, we see that how great they are in creating models. Now, as I said, brain is not something Indian thinkers could really think of, or there was no neuroscience. So these are not there. But one thing, some theoretical principles from Indian critical thinking may help us conduct experiments in psychology. Even when we create some computational model, some of those experiences, some wisdom we get from classical Indian thinkers may help us. I want to look at Indian cognitive science as an academic venture. I'm not saying that it exists. It is a venture we undertake. So let us just see what the classical Indian thinkers had to offer us. So they have unique systems, as I said already, for representing and describing knowledge. And very important, they have a logical system which is completely different from the Western logics. So we can all the time look at, reconsider, rediscover their insights. We will do a rigorous study of Indian logic, perhaps in the third session. And the Indian system, the Indian philosophical system, has an ancient tradition for representing rules. So it is not just understanding rules and talking about those, also representing the rules. And the system has unique techniques for testing and modifying definitions. Now, I don't know whether we get time to do that, but if I wish I could have some time to show how the Indian thinkers played with definitions from many different perspectives and how they would sort of look for the defects of a definition and then redefined that on the basis of their findings. We may see this in this course. And the Indian system is absolutely rigorous. It has very rigorous epistemological models which look like computational models. We should see whether our computational models can borrow any insight or can use any insight from the Indian model builders. Basically, the epistemological models may be very helpful here. And the Indian system has very well-defined cognitive systems. One such system will be studied in the third, not in the third, perhaps in the fourth lecture. And as Chomsky played a very central role in the development of cognitive science in 1950s and 60s, we can see that Indian grammarians played a very, very important role in the development of Indian thinking. We may see that in the final lecture of this series. That's the fifth lecture. And Indian philosophers, classical Indian philosophers rather, have a very strong causal approach. It is mostly based on the cause and effect relationship. We shall also see that. In some, classical Indian philosophical models may be seen as computational models. This is another thing we'll try to see. I'm not trying to say that there is a thing called Indian cognitive science. It perhaps does not exist. What exists is a networked system of very sophisticated philosophical models. So, in a sense, this course is based on a rediscovery of the Indian philosophical thoughts. It is an effort to look at Indian philosophy and Indian theories of mind through the glass of modern cognitive science. Why should we do it? The results are completely unknown. But one thing we must see, when I was thinking of this course, I was thinking of this, that what a wonderful journey, what a wonderful academic journey it could be to look at all the different avenues, all the different works of Indian philosophy from the perspective of representation and computation and networks and model making. That is another thing. These are very important pillars of cognitive science. Yes, I have to say that we don't have the neurological aspect. We don't have any neural network. We don't have any experimental psychology. But already I mentioned that a little bit of psychology we may see Indian psychology and how it can help us understand cognitive science in a new light. So the point is, we may have to develop this Indian cognitive science from the scratch. As I said, it doesn't exist, but our journey, once again, its origin, or rather the whole thing we are going to do, is not classical Indian from that perspective. It is rather reconsidering the classical Indian thought. So it's a rediscovery, as I said. Now, these are going to be our sources. The Western sources are, I must mention that our main guiding factor is going to be this textbook, which you can see here. So it is this one, this Paul Taggart 2005 Mind Introduction to Cognitive Science. This is going to be, this guided me when I was trying to design this course. And then other very important books are Noam Chomsky's Syntactic Structures. We may sort of compare the Chomskyan system with the Indian systems, grammatical systems. And then once again, Rules and Representations by Noam Chomsky. And for the logic part, we'll use the Kalish-Montague system. So the text is this: Logic, Techniques of Formal Reasoning. And another very important book would be Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. Not that our course is confined to these many texts, but these are going to be very important, and I'll mention many courses whenever required. So we now go to the next source. So the next, what I mean is the Indian sources for us. Now I enlisted the classical sources, the classical text. So these are Nyaya Sutra of Gautama. We have to. I will slowly speak about what we are going to do, our course of action. So the source books would be these. These are texts. I'm not mentioning here the papers, the secondary literature we are going to use for this course. This is the textual source. After Nyaya Sutra, it is Tarka Samgraha of Annam Bhatta with his auto-commentary, Deepika. It's a very important book for basic Nyaya, not just basic Nyaya, a little bit of advanced Nyaya also. And then Nyaya Bodhini of Govardhana Mishra, it's a commentary on Tarka Samgraha. And Bhasha Paricheda of Vishwanatha with his auto-commentary, Siddhanta Muktavali. Navya Nyaya Bhasha Pradeepa. This is a wonderful text. It's a pedagogical text, which actually is meant for the beginners in Navya Nyaya. And then finally, Tattva Chintamani of Gangesha. Now, a little bit of introduction about Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy developed as a very complex network of different ideas, but one central point was the Vedas. So some people were pro-Vedic. They wanted to support the ideas of Vedas. I'm not explaining what I mean by that, because we don't have any space for doing that. So, and some schools are anti-Vedic. So among the pro-Vedic schools, we have Samkhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Purva Mimamsa, and Uttara Mimamsa. Among this, our main focus will be on the Nyaya school. And among the anti-Vedic schools, we have the Buddhist schools. There are 4: Madhyamika, Yogachara, Sautrantika, and Vaibhashika. And then we have the Jain school, the Jain philosophy, and the Charvaka philosophy. So as I said, our main concern is going to be the Nyaya school. And another very important school I would like to mention is the philosophy of grammar, the Vyakarana Darshana, very, very important. And we can find, when you read some text in Western cognitive science or conventional cognitive science, you find that some binaries are very important, like rationalism and empiricism and realism, idealism, and stuff like that. For us, also, some binaries are very important. For example, one is this realism and anti-realism. I'm not discussing those here. And there are some tendencies. So in the Western philosophical thinking, this is a very important binary, this rationalism and empiricism. But for us, for the Indian classical thinkers rather, or for our course, it is kind of mixed up. So you can see both tendencies, rationalistic and empiricistic, in one school. So yeah, it is kind of mixed. And the topics we are going to cover, so we'll talk about cognitions, the representation of cognitions, objectness to contentness and epistemic journey, validity of cognition, knowledgehood, causation, basically causal theories of classical Indian framework, the tools for attaining knowledge, logic, the rules of inference, a cognitive system and hierarchy, philosophical grammar, rules of language, and semantic theories. Now we are going to enter the core area of our course. So the introductory part is kind of over. First, we need to talk about knowledge representation. As I said, our focus is going to be the Nyaya philosophy, because Nyayikas were debaters, they were logicians. They would set up rules for a philosophical debate, a perfect debate. So for them, it's very important to represent knowledge, cognition. Otherwise, how do they set up rules? For setting up rules, they needed to encode knowledge pieces properly. The unit of Indian epistemology. Epistemology is basically the study of knowledge. The unit of epistemology in classical India is jnana in Sanskrit, and we translate that as cognition. It is not really like a belief in the Western system. Of course, it is not knowledge. It is a different thing. It's a unique thing. It's a mental element that reveals an object. So, for example, I cognize a pot. I cognize a flower. Now, what does that cognition do for me? It actually reveals a content, and also at the same time, it owns the content. Content is Vishaya in the Indian philosophical texts in Sanskrit. Now, what is cognition? For example, it can be, so I just first give examples of cognition. I will use although cognition is not a count noun, I'm going to use the word cognition as a count noun. So I will say a cognition to mean a piece of cognition. So it may sound a little odd, but then we'll be used to it. As I said, it has to have a content. So it can be anything. It can be a piece of knowledge. For example, I see something rightly. I see my niece right in front of me. So I cognize her rightly. But I must make sure that I don't mistake my sister for my niece. If I do that, they look pretty similar. If I do that, I make a mistake. I have an illusion, right? I mistake my sister for my niece. So an illusion is a piece of cognition. A right cognition, that is, when I cognize my niece as my niece, that piece of cognition is a valid cognition, or rather a piece of knowledge, and I can have a doubt. So I can see somebody who looks like either my sister or my niece. So I don't know who that person is. I see some common properties, and then I start thinking who this person is. Is it my sister or my niece? That would be a doubt. So there are different pieces of cognitions. And also there is another categorization. We divide cognitions into two heads. One, the fresh ones, we call them anubhava. That is like the fresh cognition of my niece or my sister, or the fresh doubt as to whether she is my sister or my niece, or a fresh illusion when I mistake my sister for my niece, something like that. And what is the other one? The dispositional thing, that is a memory. A memory is another kind of cognition, which is not really a fresh one, but it is a dispositional one, right? Because I had a cognition sometime, and then it gets back to me. One thing is common among all these things. Yes, these are all mental things. Mental imaging, you may call, but more than that, we'll talk about that, whether these are mental images, and we shall examine many different pictures of it, and also I'll try to explain what it could mean actually to the classical Indian mind. I read a small quote from Shankara's Brahma Sutra Bhashya. Well, I translated it from the original Sanskrit. I didn't really give the Sanskrit quote here, but if anybody wants anytime, I can add that. So I read. one does not cause or avoid or change the content of a cognition. So the content is what it is about. So in Sanskrit, he says that kartum akartum anyat kartum na shakyate. You cannot change. It happens to you. You don't control the content of a cognition. So even if you want, you cannot have think of. So now this is the coronavirus time, and everywhere we are under a lockdown. Even if I want, I cannot really have a pizza, or I don't know anything, an ice cream. So I cannot cognize an ice cream whenever I want to, right? So it is because the content of a cognition does not depend on my wish. So, but on the other hand, there are other elements like my imagination. So if I want, I can imagine an ice cream, and I can also have it in my imagination. But a cognition is not like that, because it will happen to me. So I don't have an agency over the content of a cognition. It depends on its object, not on one's desire. That is, in Sanskrit, the Vastu Tantratva of a cognition. Vastu Tantra means you don't create it. You are not an agent as far as you don't have any agency as far as its content is concerned. It will reveal itself, and even your illusions do not depend on you. You cannot you cannot willingly mistake your sister for your niece or vice versa. You cannot do such things. So as I said, it depends on cognition depends the content of a cognition depends on its object, not on one's desire, whereas the mental events such as thinking, like imagining or meditating, depend on one's desire. So if I want, I can imagine an ice cream here. So the moment I want it to change from a vanilla one to a butterscotch one, I can do that in my imagination, or I can concentrate on it. I can meditate on it. And in my meditation, it can change its form. It depends on my desire. So these are other mental elements, my imagination, my meditation, but these are not like cognition, right? Because the content of these things can be changed. So this is what, so these are called Purusha Tantra. Purusha means any agent. It doesn't mean a man. Basically, it means an agent. So I have agency as far as the content of my imagination is concerned. So then what is the point? The point is a cognition is something that happens to me. It's a mental element which reveals some object. So as of now, we assume that there is no cognition that does not have any content. That's a matter of debate. Some Indian philosophers would claim that there are cognitions without content. And another traditional assumption of Nyaya is a cognition is formless. It doesn't have a form of its own, but its content definitely does have a form. What is it? According to the Nyaya school, the form of the content of a cognition is kind of tripartite. It has got three main elements. We will see the analysis of that. So now look at it. Look at this object. All of us know what it is. And we shall just see. We'll try to analyze this object here. I'm not naming it because there is a reason for not naming it. Then we analyze. So let us call it an apple. It is an apple, but remember, it is not just an apple. It is also a fruit, a substance, a solid thing, and many other things. Now we tend to see it as an apple, but that's okay. Let us stick to that. But I'll get back to the multiple nature of a thing later, because this will be very, very important. Now, in the Nyaya framework, an object always is understood as a trio. In the reality, it is actually a property holder or dharmin, which owns kind of a property, and the property is there in the cognition through a certain relation, and the relation is called sambandha. The property is dharma, and dharmi or dharmin is the property holder. So an apple is just one thing at a pre-philosophical level, but at the philosophical level, at the analytic level, it is actually a combination of three things. A thing, that is the property holder, which holds a property, that is in this case appleness, and not only that, it holds the property through a relationship. We'll talk about all the three later. As we see the depth of the discipline, we'll discover many different things in it. So this is the most basic thing. Now we understand that this is an understanding of the reality. So such a thing is out there, although it looks like that in the real world. In the analytic framework, this is the picture of an apple. And now there is a subject who knows it, or who intuits it, whatever you call it. The subject, how does the subject cognize this thing, which you can call it an apple, but you understand that it is actually a lot of things at the same time. So basically, kind of an epistemic connection is built. So it is established between the organ, between the sense, the relevant sense organ. In this case, it is the eyes of the subject and the object. So this connection is called Asanikarsha. So I may not all the time give the Sanskrit term for that. Sometimes I can. It is difficult to write here, so all the time I may not, but I'll try to tell you what it is. So it's a Asanikarsha. This is how we write. This is an N. So yes, what is the next step? The next step is this. But so after having established the connection, the subject cognizes the element. So this part is the cognition part. Now this part is the cognition part, and it's like a calling cloud, as we can see. And now see, as this is tripartite, this is also tripartite. This also has got three different aspects. What are those aspects? Technically, those are called the qualificant, in Sanskrit, visheshya. The qualifier, something that qualifies the qualificant, that's the prakara. And a connection, a cognitive connection. It is not an ordinary connection that is there out there, in the external, in the world, standing out there. This belongs to my knowledge world. And this is called a samsarga. I have given the term. So in this case, it happens to be inherence. In the real world also, it is inherence. So we say that appleness inheres. In philosophical literature, all the time you can see that an appleness is inherent in an apple. So inherence is the name of the relation. Similarly, here you find the same thing, as if there is a mapping between the dharma and the prakara. That is the qualifier and the property holder and the qualificant, right? So that is the dharmin and the visheshya and whatever is being known. And then there is a relation which once again is mapped to the real relation in the real world, right? So this is the analysis, tripartite analysis of it. Now here we can see that there is a kind of a reflection of this picture. As you have this trio, property holder relation, you have this trio here, that is qualificant, qualifier, and cognitive connection. We are not calling this thing a relation, but a cognitive connection. So then we will have to see why these things are called. What is a qualifier? A qualifier is something like this. Basically, the center of a cognition is this relation. Now, what is a relation? A relation is normally, so something is related to something. In most cases, this relation is asymmetric. Sometimes it can be symmetric. In this case, it is asymmetric. Why? Because you see, an apple is not inherent in applehood or appleness. Appleness is the property of being an apple, which is our qualifier. But appleness is inherent in an apple. That is how inherence is all the time asymmetric. So whatever is related to the other relatum is called the qualifier, right? So I'm not giving a definition of qualifier. It is rather how it is understood. So basically, bhasamana vaishishtya pratiyogin, something that appears to be related to something else. So that something else, which is our apple here, is at the receiving end. This is the seat, the house of the relation, and this is what is housed, right? The pratiyogi. So we understand a qualifier as something which is related to the other relatum through the cognitive connection. So these are the technical things. So finally, the picture looks pretty much like this. So the philosophical picture, the technical picture looks although like this. The knife picture would be pretty much this. That is, here is an apple, and it is cognized as an apple. So kind of a picture like this. We shall see whether this picturization is fine. So we shall start our next discussion by talking about limiting property. Can you see that we say that in this case the apple. Now, what is a limiter or a limiting property? A limiting property is something which qualifies something. Now, in my cognition, the fruit, basically this fruit is not just appearing as it's appearing as an apple, right? But it is not just an apple. It is, as I said, a lot of other things too. Now, when X becomes Y, by virtue of having the property P becomes the limiter or avachedaka, limiting property of Y-ness. This is required since X has several properties P1 through Pn. Now, how to derive it? How to derive the limiting property? You add ness to both P and Y. We'll talk about all these things in details, but this is just to introduce the topic. Now you get P-ness and Y-ness, right? And you say that P-ness, Y-ness is limited by P-ness, right? That is, it's the same thing as saying that Y-ness is the property that is limited by P-ness, or the limiter of Y-ness. The limiter of Y-ness is P-ness. We need these all these technical terms. So once again, we see we are not just seeing this. We are not seeing this as everything. It is infinite things, right? It's a red thing, or it's a reddish thing. It is a fruit, as I said. It is many other things, but it is rather seen as an apple, right? It appears in your cognition with a specific property, not all properties P1 through Pn, but a specific property, in this case, that happens to be appleness. We'll talk about how this appleness is understood in the framework of a cognition. After seeing this slide, one may think that a cognition is like a camera that captures pictures, that captures objects and gives pictures of those objects. I will try to argue in the next few slides that is perhaps not true. It is not logically correct theory that cognition is like a camera. Why not? Because think of this object. I'm not naming it. I need not name it. It is an apple. As I said, it has innumerable properties. It's an apple because it has appleness. And it is also a fruit. It's a substance. It is an effect. It's a cause, and so many others. Now, we understand that it's an apple, it's a fruit, it's a substance. How is it that it's an effect? It's an effect because there was a time when it did not exist. and some factors caused it. So any caused thing is an effect, and an effect is something that has a beginning, and also it is a cause. It causes several things. It causes specific sensations, and it causes pain when it falls on somebody's head. Also, it causes a new idea when it falls on somebody's head. So that is how it's a cause. Suppose you have eaten an apple in the morning, and in the evening, if I ask you, have you eaten a cause in the morning? What will you say? Although you have eaten a cause, you would say, I haven't. Why not? It is simply because when you cognized the apple in the morning while eating it, you cognized it under a specific mode, that is applehood, because you thought, or appleness, because you thought you were eating an apple. That means that a cognition is a very choosy thing. It does not capture all properties an object has. It cherry picks properties. It takes one or two properties, whatever, and then those things are captured. So this slide is not a great picture of a cognitive event. Rather, a better picture could be this. So this is what a cognition perhaps captures. If it captures a picture, then that picture comes with a lot of tags. So in this case, there are 3 tags. We'll see that. So the verbalization of the cognition becomes very, very important. So it is because if you just picture a thing, it is not verbalized, there is no tag, then you don't know which specific mode or which specific property is actually captured by a cognition. Whatever property is cognized as a tag, or under whichever mode an object is cognized, is called the limiting property. So, for example, in this case, because this object, whatever it is, let me have this laser pointer. Now, this object, whatever it is, because it is received by the cognition under the mode appleness, that is, as something which has appleness. Here, the limiter or the limiting property of this object becomes appleness. So this is one very rough understanding of it. Then we go to the details of it. For doing that, we need a few abbreviations, otherwise our expressions will be absolutely long. So for example, we abbreviate qualifier as QR, prakara, and the Sanskrit names you can see, I can sometimes read, and the qualificant is abbreviated as QD, and then CC abbreviates cognitive connection, that is the relation through which the qualifier is related to the qualificant. And then another very important thing is this limiter, the limiting property. And limited means something limited by some property or some relation. So, and these are relational terms. So to say, when we say y are x, we are saying that we are talking about an x that resides in y. We must see that here everywhere. The last element is being described. Now look at it. This simply says that x is limiter. So something, some property or some relation that limits x. So x avachedaka. This says that this once again describes the y or the thing, that factor which limits x. So x avachedaka y. So and this one once again, this is limited. So something which is limited by the property or relation x. So then x LDY means y limited by x, x avachina y. And the very important thing is this p. What does it mean? It simply means that we are describing an x which has y. So x having y, if you put it that way, x possessing y, y shali x. This is very important while describing a cognition. This basically says a cognition having this content. So basically we'll use it for describing a cognition having a content that is y. Well, we go to now a detailed understanding of what we just said. That is how a cognition pictures its object. Now, you see the tripartite object of already we talked about it, but here it's a different thing altogether. So, yes, it comes up with at least three elements. And remember always the qualifier, that is the mode under which something is cognized. The qualifier is related to the qualificant. In this case, there is a division. Most of the burden goes to the cluster, the qualifier relation cluster, because that cluster or that package is housed in the qualificant. The qualificant is merely a receiver. It is merely a seat. It's a house of this package, the qualifier relation package. That is the reason. That is why we said that what is a qualifier? A qualifier is the main thing that is related to the qualificant. So this is something very important. We'll actually talk about it again. This is just a starting thing, and we understand now these expressions that appleness resides in appleness. Sorry, appleness resides in the apple here. So in Sanskrit, we would say that apple nishtha, apple twa. I'm not translating apple because I don't know the Sanskrit word for that. Now, a few other things to describe our cognition. Our main target is to describe this calling cloud, which represents the cognition in this case. We understand that that appleness here becomes the qualifier. So although it has this qualificant has many other properties, what is chosen by the cognition in this case is appleness, right? That's why it becomes the qualifier. And in appleness there is qualifierness because it's the qualifier. And this qualifierness is limited by inherence because the apple is inherent in this qualificant. Appleness is inherent in this object, which is called an apple because it has appleness. So we understand this phrase. The next phrase is then we understand. So this part is somehow described, and now that this part means this part. Now we talk of this part, the qualificant part. The qualificant is apple, and therefore qualificantness, QDness, resides here. So we are talking about a qualificantness that resides in apple. Then you need something to connect the two. We'll talk about the connection in the next slide. But now, as of now, we must see that this is called determination. This is the connection, and we say, and this is a symmetric relation. That is, if X determines Y, then Y determines X. So in this case, we can now describe the whole thing. We can describe the last element of it as something like this. We are talking about a qualificantness that resides in the apple here, and that qualificantness is determined by a qualifierness that is limited by inherence and that resides in appleness, right? That's a description of this qualificantness. In Sanskrit, we could put it this way: apple twa nishtha samavaya sambandha avachinna prakarata nirupita apple nishtha visheshyata. Then how to describe the calling cloud, that is the cognition? This thing, whatever we said, we described it. Now this whole thing now belongs to this cognition as a content. So the cognition is it's this content, this cognition possesses this content. That is what this is actually trying to say. So this is a unique description of this cognition. Now the apple could have been captured as a fruit. The moment you capture it as a fruit, the whole equation changes. So it would be another cognition altogether. Although the same thing is cognized by it, the cognition changes because its mode changes. Now we talk a little bit about the determination stuff. Why we could have simply said that here is a cognition which has the qualificantness that is an apple or an apple, and the qualifierness that is in appleness. That would do. But I will show you that that would not do. Why not? Because think of it. Instead of cognizing just one apple, you can also cognize a paper and an apple. What happens here is you find four things. You find two qualifiednesses and you find two different qualificantnesses. So one qualifiedness resides in appleness and one in papernness, and one qualificantness resides in apple or the apple. Actually, the problem is in Sanskrit there is no article. So while talking about the Sanskrit constructions, it is very difficult to use articles. Often we tend to drop those. And then the qualificantness resides in the paper. Here comes determination. To create the thread, one thread runs through this whole thing because this describes this object. And another thread runs through this whole thing and that describes this object. Without having these two threads, it would be it would be a stupid thing, very unrelated thing, and that's it. That is the reason we need determination. Now we can talk about a cognition having two distinct qualificantnesses that are determined by distinct things, right? So we understand that a qualifierness is basically a distinguisher. So, for example, when an apple is cognized as an apple, that is, when it is cognized as something having appleness, appleness distinguishes it. So it's very important to look at the limiting property or the limiting relation as a distinguisher, right? Here you can see that. So here is a guy called Dick, and Dick is an apple possessor. So when a subject sees Dick, they cognize this. Dick is an apple possessor, and here we will see what is what. So in this case, this apple distinguishes this man called Dick. Therefore, the qualifier is the apple, the qualificant is Dick, and the cognitive connection is contact, which exists between the apple and Dick. In this case, there is the qualifierness in the apple, because here what distinguishes this qualificant is not appleness but apple itself, or rather this apple itself. So that is the reason you say that there is a qualifierness that resides in the apple, and this qualifierness is limited by two aspects now. One, a limiting relation, which is contact, because it is in contact with this qualificant, and also it is limited by a limiting property, that is appleness. Why so? Because this becomes the qualifier while having appleness, the specific property, and while being related to the qualificant through contact. So that is the reason the special property it gains, that is the qualifierness, has got two limiting aspects. The relation, that is contact, and also the property, that is here in this case appleness. And there is the qualificantness in Dick. So you talk about these two, and they determine each other, and we have a cognition. We go to the cognition after some time, because we need to once again analyze the structure of this whole thing and also a few technical details. Now concentrate on Dick, who is holding an apple. So this is the form of this cognition is Dick is an apple possessor, as we have said. Now, as we said, the qualificant is Dick, the qualifier is the apple. This is fine, and then the cognitive connection is that is some yoga contact through which the qualifier, that is the apple, is there in the qualificant. We understand that pretty well. Now the question is, suppose we snatch now the apple, because we need to analyze the qualifier separately to derive all its properties and relations and all that stuff. Now we snatch this apple from Dick. So this is not a separate apple. This is this very apple. So, and then we just talk about it. It's the qualifier Now, what is it we need to consider? I requote a slide of mine, I recall. So the slide said, when an entity X becomes Y by virtue of having the property P, P becomes the limiter, avachedaka, of Y-ness. Here is the case. This apple becomes the qualifier by virtue of having appleness. Therefore, appleness becomes the qualifying property or the limiter, limiting property of what? Not of the qualifier, but of qualifierness. So the apple has substanceness, entityness, fruitness, etc. It has multiple properties, but not that every property is limiting the qualifierness this apple has. So you now have to add ness to y, that is whatever it becomes. Here it becomes a qualifier, and you get y-ness. So qualifier plus ness is qualifierness. So so I just correct an old slide of mine. In a previous slide, I showed this. These are mistakes I made there. So actually, it should not be p-ness. We should not get p-ness at all. So the corrected slide should be this. So this is a corrected form anyway. So so then we get back to the topic. So as we said that the apple is the qualifier. The qualifier, it becomes a qualifier. Therefore, it somehow gains this new property qualifierness the moment it is held by Dick, and also it has this appleness, and also so therefore appleness limits the qualifierness. We'll talk about this again because it's a very, very important topic. But that is not the end of the story, because the apples becomes a qualifier while having appleness and while being connected with Dick through contact. So this qualifierness has got two limiting factors. One, the property that is appleness, and two, the relation that is contact. So therefore, we just describe it this way. We just say that here is a cognition which has the qualificantness which is there in Dick, and the qualificantness is determined by the qualifierness that is limited by two aspects: appleness, the property, and contact, the relation. And the qualifierness in turn resides in an apple. So this is a formal identity, like this UPEC nomenclature in chemistry. It's a formal identity. It's a formal name for this cognition, that is Dick is an apple possessor. And a few other issues. We once again concentrate on the apple separately. This is another very very important issue, but it's called Madhyavarti Vishayata. That means something which has two different Vishayatas. For example, with respect to Dick, the apple is the qualifier. Therefore, qualifierness resides in the apple while being limited by contact and appleness. We understand. But with respect to appleness, which is another property that qualifies the apple, it is a qualificant also, right? The same apple also is a qualificant with respect to appleness. Therefore, it has a qualificantness which is limited by a qualifierness that is there in appleness, right? Now, how to relate these two? So this is according to Gadadhara Bhattacharya, who was one of the greatest Nayayikas of all time. He was a 16th, 17th century, perhaps 17th century Nayayika from Navadvipa. He would say that in this case, these two things, that is this qualifierness and this qualificantness, would limit each other. And then finally, I think it requires a correction. This should be actually, I corrected. This should be actually LD, not DD. So basically, we would say that here the qualifierness residing in the apple. So you can describe it. This qualifierness, which is limited by both contact and appleness, is is limited by this qualificantness, which is once again limited, limited by a qualifierness that is there in appleness, and which, that is the qualificantness, is there in an apple. This whole thing now, describes, or this whole thing now figures in the cognition. And so the cognition will be, you just add to this, you have to add the qualificant, that is dick, which does not figure here. So you just say that it is determined, or it is determining another complex, that is, this is dick, and R, that is that thing is residing. What is it? It is basically the QD-ness, right? It is a qualificantness which is there in dick, and then the whole thing, and then you add P, and then it's a cognition, right? So here is a cognition which has the qualificantness that resides in dick, and that is determined by a qualifierness which we already described. Not that this is the only analysis of it. There are other ones, and if we get a chance, we may talk about that also. So I end this session here. Thank you very much.